Thanks for joining me on today's 172nd Air Wing video. We have up for review and discussion an F-14 in the colors of VF-74, Modex 101, serial number 162707, circa 1987. So this airplane has quite a history to it, and it has nothing to do with the color scheme, which, if we're honest, is somewhat de rigueur of what you would expect an F-14 in high-vis colors of the time. No, what makes this airplane unique is it is one of the few F-14s in history to have ever shot down a U.S. Air Force F-4 Phantom II. How that happened and the weird circumstances of that is what we'll cover, which is the reason this release is so unique. So to get the complete scoop of what happened here, I would highly recommend anyone interested in more to look at War Channel's YouTube, War Carrol YouTube channel. I'm sure many of you out there that are patronizing this particular YouTube channel are also subscribers of his. If you're not, go check it out. And I'm not being compensated for saying that. It's just that his channel happens to have a really good video that explains some more of the background behind the politics of the situation, which is a bit more detailed than we want to cover in today's model review. So for those of you who are new to my channel, what I like to do is to conduct reviews of 1/72nd scale models, and I talk about the history of them, because ultimately fighter aircraft, contrary to what you might think from Hollywood, are not just articles flown by one or two people for a period of time. It takes a team of people to make even one fighter jet sortie work. You have the maintainers who work on the airplane, you have the engine people who work on the jet engines, the people that work on the munitions and weapons, the people that maintain the hydraulics and the avionics, the people who maintain the ground equipment. Without any of that stuff, you don't have a flight. So those people's stories are important to cover, and since Hollywood doesn't seem to be interested in making a movie about those folks, we gotta talk about them here. So with all that outlined, let's jump into the story behind this aircraft. So in September of 1987, during a routine exercise in the Mediterranean Sea, this airplane was flown by Lieutenant Timothy Dorsey, once again a VF-74, which is called B-doublers. Now the exercise setup was a U.S. Air Force RF-4C reconnaissance airplane would play the role of an attacker. This happens relatively frequently. Generally, the Air Force and the Navy will collaborate to test each other's skills. In this particular instance, it was to test the USS Saratoga's ability to identify and intercept a potentially hostile airplane that is approaching an aircraft carrier. The reason this is important is because the role of the F-14 was fleet defense, and the first job of the F-14 was to safeguard the carrier that it launched from air attack. since airplanes can carry long-range missiles that can potentially sink a ship, it's important that a F-14 at the time could intercept and engage an airplane that could potentially be a threat to the carrier strike group. So the F-14 was on its role of defending the carrier. The U.S. Air Force F-4 would stand in as an attacking airplane, since, again, 1987 here, the Cold War is still going on, so using Russian airplanes was a bit out of the option for the time. So what we're going to look at here is a footage of what happened that day directly from the heads-up display or HUD camera tapes of the F-14 depicted here.
Go to HUD here real quick.
I'm taking some TCS right now.
Okay. Get a little offset. There he goes.
101, strike.
101, simulator clock 2.
Copy.
Didn't go.
At 100, your status.
Didn't go.
We're joining now.
Kill.
Fortunately, the shot down friendly U.S. Air Force F-4, which was pretending to be the attacker, the pilots were not hurt in the incident immediately, and they were rescued, ironically enough, by the same aircraft carrier that they were in the exercise supposed to approach. While the crew of the F-4 again didn't have any immediate injuries, the front seat pilot, Captain Michael Ross, needed 32 surgeries over a period of decades to address long-term complications from his spine due to ejecting. One of the things that many people may not realize about ejecting from combat airplanes is it is a little bit safer than dying in the jet, but not by much. Even the best engineered seats have a certain range of ejection parameters that are considered safe for the people in it, because the ejection seat has to launch out of the airplane at an extremely fast velocity using a rocket motor. It is not uncommon for pilots and backseaters, whether they're Navy Rios or Air Force Wizzos, to have complications from ejecting from an airplane. Again, it's healthier than being blown to bits inside of it. However, that does not preclude the possibility of long-term complications due to flailing injuries or spinal injuries from your spinal cord, in this case being subjected to 20 G's of force directly straight up in microseconds. So as a result, many people may think that ejecting from an airplane is kind of a walk-it-off sort of deal, and sometimes it is. That's the ideal scenario, but it is also not uncommon for people who eject from combat airplanes to suffer complications, potentially career-ending complications. Many pilots and backseaters that have ejected over the course of tactical aviation have been reassigned to desk jobs because after ejecting, again, it's better than dying, but they are no longer in a medical condition to fly. And unfortunately, that seemed to be the case for Lieutenant Ross on that day. As for Lieutenant Timothy Dorsey, who was the fine gentleman, air quotes here, flying the F-14 on this day, the U.S. Navy Review Board had ruled that he would keep his wings after negligently shooting down this U.S. Air Force aircraft in a clearly defined exercise. What's interesting, and what may have played a role in this determination, is that rather than the lieutenant in question losing his wings and being reassigned to life as a civilian, Lieutenant Timothy Dorsey's father was captain of the aircraft carrier USS America at the time and was destined to become a flag officer in the U.S. Navy. So potentially this is another case of that old saying of it's not what you know, it's who you know. So interestingly enough, Dorsey, his dad, Lieutenant Timothy Dorsey's dad, the captain of the USS America, was himself involved in a friendly fire incident during the Vietnam War. Apparently, Dorsey Sr. shot down his wingman by accident over the skies of North Vietnam. So, seeing as how that gentleman went on to become an admiral, I guess we have another saying we can call to mind, like father, like son, huh? So, Lieutenant Dorsey's career, while no longer in the aviation community, was not too terribly damaged. Lieutenant Dorsey would go on to promote in the Navy as a leader of the Defense Intelligence Agency, or a branch of the Defense Intelligence Agency, going on from there to be head of the Navy Reserve Inspector General. And then as a captain, his paperwork and promotional request was forwarded by the Navy to the U.S. Senate for appointment to Rear Admiral in 2012. Now, if you're thinking that, WTF, well, you weren't alone in that assessment. A certain Air Force officer felt the same way and wrote a letter to the Senate essentially explaining the circumstances of why it was that, among other complications, he had to go into surgery 32 times and was ruled as disabled by the VA upon his retirement. That fact, and the general inquiries around the shoot-down, resulted in the U.S. Senate declining to act on the promotion nomination. Now, for those of you who may not be fluent in the language of Washington bullshit, what that means is the Senate essentially declined promotion without actually saying that they declined promotion, because the Senate is run by politicians, and politicians literally build careers of saying stuff without actually saying anything. So, Lieutenant Dorsey would move on to become a captain and would retire after the incident was concluded in 2012. So, after being declined for Senate, I guess Captain Dorsey at that point felt that he was going to move on to bigger and better things. Now, another note that I'll point out, the Navy ranks are different than the Air Force ranks because, well, the Navy just has to be weird like that. So understand that when I refer to Captain Dorsey, that is a Navy rank of 06, which is equivalent to a Air Force 06 Colonel. Okay, so that's a fairly high up senior position. Air Force captains are 03s, and that pay grade in 03 is a lieutenant for the Navy. Set me straight in the comment section if I got that wrong. It's been a while since I had to think about joint services ranks. Anyways, with all that laid out, you can see that even though this particular F-14 doesn't have perhaps the most flashiest color scheme, it certainly has a very flashy history. Unfortunately, the F-14 in question was not just going to be famous for this incident. Unfortunately, the aircraft would go into a flat spin accident in the 1990s and crashed with both crews killed, unfortunately. So I was actually kind of scared to see that, well, maybe scared is not the right word, but alarmed to see how badly the accident statistics of the F-14 were. Unfortunately, that scene where you see Goose bite the dust in Top Gun 1, there's definitely a kernel of truth to that. The F-14, in certain parts of its career, was not a very safe airplane to fly, and greater than 60 crews have passed away flying this thing over a period of about 30 years. So it wasn't the safest airplane. There were times where they did get issues sorted out, and later in the Tomcat's life, it was much less dangerous, especially when they replaced the troublesome TF-30 motors with the F-110s that GE had made later in the F-14Bs and F-14Ds. So the F-14As, like this one, had many issues with the TF-30 motors, as some of you are well aware. And part of that was because the TF-30 was never supposed to be put into this airplane in the first place. The Pratt & Whitney TF-30 engine was originally built for the F-111, which is a completely separate airplane. And the engine, that TF-30 engine, was only installed in the F-14 as a stopgap because the program was running into delays. And to keep the flight test schedule going, they put TF-30s in these F-14s as a temporary measure. Well, as a backup to that old saying that there's few things more permanent than a temporary military decision, the TF-30s went from being a stopgap engine only for the test program to, well, they'll keep the engines in the first 100, and then the F-14 would use a different engine after the B model in the early 70s, or excuse me, the early 80s, and then after delays and overruns and cost cutting, the Navy scrapped the actual engine the airplane was supposed to have and just used the TF-30 all the way up until the F-14's retirement. The Navy would eventually order the General Electric F-110, installing those in the F-14B and the F-14D between the 1990s and the aircraft's retirement in 2006. So that did seem to help things a little bit with the safety situation and certainly improve the Tomcat's performance. But yeah, that decision to have the TF-30 and the cost cutting there certainly had some drastic consequences for many of the crews that flew this airplane over its service history. So with all that laid out, let's hop on to the pros and cons of things. So this particular F-14 is from Calibre Wings, and many of the things that I'm going to talk about in this review are things that I've mentioned before in my earlier Calibre Wings videos. So the first pro we'll talk about is price. You can get these relatively affordably. Many Calibre Wings F-14s are selling for pretty high amounts of money now. It's been a while since they've released an F-14 tooling, and it's getting a bit scarce to find some that you can get at a reasonable price. I'm glad to share, though, that this F-14, because I suspect it's a relatively plain airplane, it's not flying off the shelves. And because of that, it's available for relatively attainable prices. You can get them at the time of this video for about $160 plus shipping and handling and any importation fees you may have in your area. So it's not cheap, but as Calibre Wings F-14 models go, it is very attainable for what you get now. The other good thing to share is that it has a very full complement of weapons and accessories, which is not necessarily the case for all of Calibre Wings F-14 releases. So I'm glad to see that we have a pretty full loadout of weapons and missiles and configurations for the AIM-7s, which are these missiles here. Then you have the AIM-9s, which are the little ones here. And not pictured, for reasons I will get to shortly, you also have your rails for the Phoenix ones. You can install them on 2 in the front, 2 in the area between the engine nacelles. And if you want, you can equip the pylons that have the mounting points for 1 on each side under the wings, 2 for the full load of 6, if you are so inclined. Just bear in mind that in operational use, the F-14 never carried more than 4, just because of the bring back weight. When they would launch off of an aircraft carrier, there's a certain amount of weight that the airplane has to have in order to safely land, or you break things and bad things happen. So they would not launch with 6, just because that would meant that they'd have to bring all 6 back if they never fired any, and that puts the F-14 over the safe landing weight. So most of the time they only carried 4, and usually because of the expense of the missiles, they generally carried 2 max in operational use. So we'll get into why I didn't display it with the Phoenix missiles, because usually with my reviews, I try to showcase all of the loadouts that come with it. I didn't do that in this instance, and that's something I will cover later in some of the cons. So the other pros of the model, the TF-30 intake faces are modeled really nicely. You can't see them unless you basically shine a light directly down the intake, but they are modeled accurately. You can look down the intake and have an honest-to-goodness compressor face, which is nice. Attaboy to Calibre Wings and Noel Lee's team for making that happen. You have detachable engine nozzles, so you can display them with the engine nozzles at full afterburner or not afterburner, which is nice. You can showcase on the ground properly shut down, because when these F-14s are deactivated, because of the way the hydraulic system works, one of the engine nozzles will be in the fully open position and the other one will be in the fully closed. The reason for that, again, is just to do with how the hydraulic system works when one engine is powered down, and how the hydraulic system is still operating with the second engine when it's still running. So you can model that accurately with your Calibre Wings. Just have an asymmetrical setup where you have one big and one small on one side if you want to show it in the parked and engine off position accurately. The parts quality are really well done. The AIM-7 missiles, the AIM-9s and the Phoenixes, as well as the rails and the pylons, they are very well done in terms of appearance. The weathering, because this is the one that has the weathering on it. You can get this clean, but I ordered the weathering one, and I'm glad I did, because it gives it a little bit more realistic, grimy look. Calibre is probably the only company I would say that you should consider ordering the weathered version for, because I'm usually not a fan of companies making weathered models, but in this case, Calibre's done a really good job of putting the panel lines and showcasing that a bit more with that. The pilot and the Rio detail are really well done. The RIO in the back, the helmets and the details are really nice. I'm glad to see that because Hobbymaster, that tends to be a weak point for one of their models. So the RIO is, again, really well detailed, as is the pilot. Would have been nice to see some like a white helmet here instead of the gray, but that's not a major deal. Still well done with the crew. And yeah, it's F-14. It looks freaking cool. I mean, even in a relatively plain Jane color scheme, it looks pretty darn cool because, you know, Tomcats, right? Which brings us to the cons. This is going to be a familiar refrain on Calibre Wings F-14s, but the small parts fit and the tolerances are just absolutely terrible. It has been a frustrating experience shooting this video because anytime I touch this model or handle it, stuff just falls off. I've got blue tack holding up basically just about everything attached to this model except the underwing, or excuse me, the under engine nacelle fuel tanks, one here and one here. Those are about the only two accessories on this airplane that are not being held down by blue tack sticky putty right now. If I just blow on this model hard enough, I can probably get the AIM-9 Sidewinder right here to fall off the rail. So it's Calibre Wings gives you a lot of options to configure the airplane to display it however you want in this release, which is great, but man, it's the tolerances on this are just a joke. I had to cut one of the pylons off to get I had to cut one of the fittings off to get one of the Phoenix rails in there, and then the other one was too loose, so I have blue tack holding it up. I also have blue tack holding up the one that you just saw me point out. I mean, this thing, it's frustrating. It's frustrating to have that problem on a model that costs $160 something, and it's really frustrating to have all these options to display it, but you know deep down that, okay, if you want to attach something to the model, you're going to have to break out glue and stuff to try to get it to, you know, you got to break out stuff to get that stuff to fit, because you either got to sand it or you got to use white glue like Elmer's or blue tack to keep it attached, and you still might wake up one day, walk to your display case, and find something hanging off of the airplane at a weird angle or on the floor of your display case because something fell off. As a matter of fact, in the intro footage, I didn't notice until I looked at it in editing, but the left pylon here, or I should say the starboard pylon right here, was hanging down at a weird angle when I was shooting footage of the inside of the engine compressor, where you can look down and see the turbine blades. The starboard pylon is like at a weird tilted angle, and that's the problem. That's the issue with these. You try to put stuff on in the model and it's just hanging by a thread, or it's not fitting, or you got to file it down, or you got to use blue tack, or all of the above. It's a mess, and it's also an issue with their Su-24 release too. So lots of options. It's good to see, but it's also not fun to have to basically kit build your accessories because they don't fit. And that's one of the detracting points of owning one of these. So just know that in advance, you're going to have some problems with that when it's time to display it, unless you just display it completely naked and clean, and that may be the saner approach to go with if you get one of these. The other thing to note here is that the angle of the engine intakes is a bit extreme relative to the actual airplane. It's not supposed to be at this much of an angle. It's supposed to be just a little bit shallower. And you can tell that because the pylon for the Phoenix rail is a little bit narrower than it should be. And that's because the intake face is too deep, because the angle is too extreme. It's not a major concern if you just have Calibre Wings F-14s, but if you park this thing next to a Century or a Hobbymaster equivalent, you'll see why that may be an accuracy concern. So the other issue that may be a concern is when you put the RIO and the pilot in the cockpit, you will need tweezers, because the clearance between the canopy and the frame when you have it open is not going to be enough for medium or large size fingers to get anything in there. You might be able to get the pilot in there, you're not getting the backseater in there without tweezers. So just bear in mind, you will need that. Also, something I'll put in the not bad, not good maybe category are the glove vanes. So right here and on the other side, you have a little surface that comes out when the F-14A goes above the speed of sound, And Calibre Wings has included that as an option to display it, which is good. What is not necessarily good is how you have to deploy it, because to do that, you have to take the cover here off for the landing gear, put like your tweezers or some other tool in there to push these out, and then you got to cover it up if you want to display it in flight. And you wouldn't display it with the canards, with the glove vanes out and the airplane on the ground. I'm sure maybe a maintenance function that might make sense, but you know, if you're flying above the speed of sound, you're not doing it parked at, you know, 0 airspeed. So if you're going to display that way, you're going to display it in flight. And if you're displaying it in flight, just be aware that when you set this out and you put the cover back in, you're going to bump stuff. And like I said, everything on this dang model has crappy tolerances, so you're going to be, pylons are going to be coming off the plane, and you're going to have to, you know, blue tack things back on. So yeah, it's not a good, not a bad thing. I just leave it displayed with those in, because most of the time that's how they flew, and for corrosion reasons, the U.S. Navy deactivated them anyway. And on the D models, I think they just didn't even include them. They just fared over that whole area because the glove vanes really didn't do much for performance. And then finally, this is just a unique issue that I found with this release. The external fuel tank here, the starboard fuel tank, just has this big old seam right here. I don't know if it's because they just didn't, you know, fillet it or didn't paint it or what, but the left one on the other side looks great. This one, you've got a big old gap right here. It's, in the scheme of things, I'm not worried about it, but it is something to note as, once again, not good, not a bad thing, just an observation. So all things considered, because of the price of it and the fact that Calibre Wings F-14 seem to be getting thinner and thinner on the ground, I would say it's a worthwhile release to add. It's a relatively nondescript F-14, so the prices are pretty reasonable. You can still get them at stores for less than like $180, give or take, depending on shipping, taxes, and the like, which is more than I can say for a lot of their releases now. Some of their more colorful ones, like the Top Gun F-14s, the actual Naval Fighter Weapons School Top Guns, not the film versions that are, you know, there's no getting those now for anything reasonable. But the Naval Fighter Weapons School F-14s, you can get those, and they're a bit more colorful, but they'll run you close to $200. Whereas this one, it's relatively reasonable. You get a full complement of weapons, which you don't get on the Naval Fighter Weapons School Aggressor ones, so just bear that in mind. And all things considered, it's still a Tomcat, so it looks freaking cool, and it's got a pretty interesting history behind it too, I think. So with that, we will wrap today's video. Thank you all for watching. Those of you who are subscribers, I extend my heartfelt appreciation for you all to show your support to the channel. If you like this video, consider clicking the like button. And if you are not a subscriber, just bear in mind, if you are, you'll be notified when I release a new video. If you click the bell icon, YouTube will happily tell you when I release my next video. All of the videos that I make are of my own collection, so I'm not a storefront. I do not run a business selling these. So everything you see is what's in my personal collection, and therefore it's an honest assessment of what somebody who paid their own money to get these is saying. So with that, once again, thank you all for watching and subscribing, and we will catch you in the next one.